microphone. First, an observation that I already made to those of you who were here on time. I observe that the younger generation has a decreasing resistance to coping with the harsh of life, and therefore you are unable to come, some of you at least. If you start getting late at your age, you won't be able to come when you will come to my age. So you should start doing some sports, eat more vegetables, drink less, don't eat meat, and try to wake up a little bit earlier. And now I have the pleasure to introduce to you my colleague Ivo Bohac, and he is an architect. We will have two presentations from colleagues from Brno University. The partnership between the Polytechnic Institute of Tomar and Manhã Center and the Technical University of Brno is a long story. If you go to, I take the occasion already to introduce my colleague Helena Zemankova, that she will speak afterwards, and they come from the same university. And in fact, we done many projects in the past. Both Ivo and Helena have been here. If you go to ITM, if you go up the stairs, you will see some posters on the right, that are framed. This was a workshop that Helena conducted in one of the seminars in the past with students. And I'm very pleased. So you will see what we try to bring here is different perspectives around the same theme. And we have already had several different understandings, from philosophy to archaeology. And today we have two great architects who have done very interesting projects. You can also find some of their work in the library. Please.
One, two, three, go. Yeah. Okay. The present topic does not deal with the transformation and adaptation of the human community itself, not only about it. The present topic deals with changes, transformation and adaptation of the castle in response to the changes in ownership and changes in priority function. Now, in a few last years, take place restoration and reconstruction in the area of castle. The cooperation with the new private owner made it possible to use the process of restoration of this cultural monument as part of the educating process at our Faculty of Architecture. That's a second reason why I want to present to you this topic. This slide is just about the content of presentation. from introduction and informations about problem. No? Yeah. And informations about founding of the manor house, informations about transformation and rebuilding to the 21st century with new owner, with new functions, and new space for an educational laboratory. Now we can start. In this introduction are just for your information some data about locality. The village Račice is located on South Moravia, on the Drahan Highlands, near Brno, in Czech Republic, of course. The panoramic views are dominated by a castle whose figure can be seen far from the landscape. Sorry. The castle of Račice is connected with varied history, which broadly touches on pan-European events and history. The history of the castle and château is connected with a number of Czech, Moravian, and European aristocracy families. This chapter, chapter 1, is about the founding of the manor house and about first owners. The castle was founded in the first half of the 13th century. The first owners was lords from family Hrabišice. The short time owned the castle Templar Knights, for example. Very difficult period is time of Friedrich of Rinava. Friedrich was a leading figure in the resistance against King John of Luxembourg. And that's why Castle Račice was in 1312 destroyed and burned by the royal troops. The castle was a combination of residential house and military fortress in that time. The chapter 2 presents Castle Račice like Hussite military fortress. This phase castle get on the start of the 15th century. Owners of the castle was lords from Kravaře. But the medieval town Vyškov near Račice, approximately 10 kilometers from Račice, was a residence of the Catholic bishop. And that's why the castle fortress in Račice was second time conquest and destroyed. On the picture, we can see a digital reconstruction of the medieval Hussite fortress in Račice. Chapter 3, remained period of the Renaissance reconstruction. In the second half of the 16th century, come new aristocratic owners, the Haugwitz family, and rebuilt the castle, became the means of aristocratic representation. These pictures present Renaissance form of the castle, approximately at the beginning of 17th century, on a student's digital models. Situation in the 17th century is military function ends, residential function returns, and function of representation is added. The next important period is time of aristocracy family Lord Petralčí from Petrwald. They rebuilt castle or chateau to the monumental Renaissance form with many of the masterpieces like this fireplace or stone arcade in the courtyard and other. Continue, yeah. Number 16, yeah. But The revolt of the Czech aristocracy and the battle on the White Mountain near Prague are coming, and the history of the castle, connected with leading Czech and Moravian noble families, ends. Chapter 4 talk about a new type of owner. This new type is entrepreneur. This period starts in 1802. The most important entrepreneur, like the owner of Račice Castle, is Baron John Mundy, textile businessman. The picture shows the form of the castle from that time in the painting of Francis Richter, Czech painter. John Baron Mundy was one of the most important textile entrepreneurs in the Czech lands. He exported fabrics not only to the area of Habsburg monarchy, but also to Italy, Germany, Poland, Russia, Turkey, and other countries. That's why the combination of residential function and capital presentation came back. Presentation of capital and power, presentation of social prestige. Short period of the castle's history, present chapter 5. The castle returned its military function in 1939 at the beginning of the Second World War. The castle was the seat of the Czech Army Command a few days. And now about the post-war years. The new owner coming the state and nationalization. The castle changed its functions for several years, from the recreation center to the headquarters of the offices, for example. In 1962, start next period of Chateau's history. From that time is Chateau the seat of the special boarding school for young peoples with various forms of physical or mental disabilities. And now, last period of the Chateau's history. In 2017, the state, the region office, sold the castle Račice to the company E-Finance Developer, investment real estate company operating on the Czech market since 2001. Chapter 9 is about present and future of the castle. Castle Areal has a new owner and gradually accept a new function like a hotel complex. At first, we create modern hotel complex with a range of accommodation standards and corresponding background services. This transformation takes place gradually. This picture, another picture presents actual standards of accommodation in Chateau Areal. Very important is creating of the space with unique and exclusive atmosphere for cultural events. The castle needs, of course, strict attention to historical, architectural and artistic craftsmanship values during the restoration of historical buildings. The castle serves and will also serve as an exhibition for tourism. The last chapter, number 10, deals about real space for ideal space for an educational laboratory. The monument restoration in Račice Castle is a great opportunity to educate young architects on faculty on the field of monument preservation and cultural heritage protection. It is a possibility for active monitoring of the progress of monument restoration in all its phases. We can monitoring conservation principles and methods, historical values and their preservation, artistic or craft values and their preservation. We organize the international students' workshops there, of course. Regularly, we organize the Seminar of Monument Care for students of our faculty. Chateau Račice is place for teaching of monument care, from lectures and seminars to international workshops and semestral students' projects or designs like that. And now we have a short movie, short animation, shows the essential phases of the transformation of castle during the history. The digital models in presentation, this next animation, or the book or booklet here, were created by students as part of a monument preservation school seminar. These materials are prepared for tourist visitors of Chateau and serves for the popularization of the history of Chateau. Now, just a moment. Now, short movie. Castle Račice, history in pictures. Yes, yes. At first, yeah. Yeah. This is first period, first medieval castle. Second period, medieval military fortress. Owners are lords from Caravaggio. Short period from Baroque. Today's situation is practically the same like form from Račice's period. Period of Baroque John.
Zhodnotíme vaše...
Okay, that's finish of my short presentation. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Helena is here. Yeah, Helena.
Good morning, everybody. Bonjour à tous. I am very happy to have chance to return in Março. Thanks to not only Luis, but all organizers. I think it was nice for our faculty, for my students too. And for today, I would like to start before my presentation, small text, but to speak about this subject of my presentation. 2 years ago, I was invited by Institut de Géoarchitecture de Brest, the University Bretagne Occidental, and I collaborate a lot of time with this university, and this university decided to prepare a project, European project, in program Creative Europe, and this Institut de Géoarchitecture decided to invite Dresden University, as Dresden had the same problem during after Second World War, the same destiny, and city Brest and city Dresden was destroyed, and I think this institute decided to create project Les Villes en Reconstruction. As my orientation, professional orientation, is to reconstruction, to reutilization, to conversion of industrial heritage, and now my city, Brno, is industrial city. I complete this project by this under reconstruction. I would like to allow me to invite you to Brno, to city of my faculty architecture, and I try to show you something from history of my city, and something for future. At the beginning of the last century, the construction of large factory in Brno radically transform the medieval image of the city. This process, which began in the last quarter of the 18th century, increased under the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, taking advantage of the relative proximity of Vienna. In picture, you can see big factory in urban structure of Brno. It is from late of 19th century. It is factory, textile factory, Brother Scheller. And another picture is the same tire, some big factory, another owner. It was Aaron Jacob Löfberg, big industrialist in this 19th century, and they created this factory, proper brother. This complex exists, but it is not a textile factory now. It is facility for inhabitants, and in this picture you can see small part of my city with hill. Spielberg is in castle. It is not far from our faculty. And Brno thus became the largest textile production center in the empire, earning the name of Moravian Manchester, and second after Vienna for mechanical industry. This advantageous situation was maintained in the young Czechoslovakia during the inter-World War period. However, during the Second World War, most of Brno industrial facilities were severely damaged by bombing during air raids. The factories were originally located at the city gates along the rivers Svratka, river Svitava, and small river Ponavka, which powered the machine and were used to soak the wool for dyeing. In this plan from 1815, you can see red circle, a position of a lot of textile factory from this beginning of 19th century. But the growth of the city gradually absorbed this factory into the urban structure. You can see a lot of streets, Sale, Špitálka, Křenova, etc. And we continue to understand that many factories in the textile sector had been established and operated by Jewish manufacturers, Jewish fabricants, who were persecuted or forced into exile during the period of Nazi occupation, and their property was confiscated. In this list, you can see a lot of names of Jewish owner. It was Aaron and Jacob Löfberg founded a spinning mill in Brněnec. Perhaps everybody know a list of Oskar Schindler. He worked there, and Löfberg, a fabricant, established another building not only in Brněnec but in Brno, 1877, and another last name is Joseph and Natan Šťastný, founded an innovative men's clothing factory in Brno, in street Kizova, and I can show you another name, Max Kohn, who started his business in Vienna, later built a wool factory in Brno. This is now in street Vlhka. You can speak more about this factory. And when Max Kohn, he died, Fritz Tugendhat took over the business. The building remains in the Mosilana factory. And last, the name is Eduard Essler, Jewish owner, became the owner of the factory in Obřany. And question, what remains of this prosperous era? Today, the memory of this industrialist lives on in the often remarkable architecture of the villas they had built for themselves. I would like to show you some famous villa, Villa Löfberg family is in this picture, and the Löfberg Villa now houses the Brno Region Museum and a permanent exhibition on the industrialization of the city. And famous villa, Tugendhat, perhaps everybody know it, and Löfberg gave their daughter Greta part of their garden, and in the moment when she married Fritz Tugendhat, and this young family in 1930 asked Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, famous architect, to build a villa for them in the Černapole district of Brno. Now this villa is listed on the UNESCO World Heritage. And last villa, I show you villa owner, fabrikant, industrialist Šťastný. This villa was created by Arnold Wiesner, Jewish architect, famous architect, 1929, and he built villa of industrialist Alfred Šťastný in a 3-hectare garden. During the war, when Czechoslovakia was invaded, it was occupied by the Gestapo. Today, it houses the Methodological Center for Modern Architecture. And a large part of Brno's industrial heritage disappeared during the 2 world wars. Other buildings that bear witness for this activity fell victim to urban renewal and, above all, to desindustrialization. But what has survived is considerable and representative. And there are two big rivers in Brno, Svitava and Svratka. Svitava is along of Svitava is zone industrial, and this river is bordered by an industrial area with many old factories in a pleasant environment. I think it is nice environment, and it is chance to transform this factory, abandoned factory, for new facility for inhabitants in Brno. And the new owners who acquired their factories during the privatization, it was after our revolution on Velour in the 1999, really understood the potential of this heritage, being content to make temporary use of these long abandoned buildings. Some building, some factory is provisory reuse and wait for new life, second life, and some building is damaged. Building, excellent building owners Essler spinning mill in quarter suburb of Brno in Obřany. This building with new use continue to fall into disappear. I'm sorry. Sometimes the land occupied by the abandoned factory is attractive only for its development potential. which that has the sustainability of the building. Through their idea and project, students can open up new perspective for reuse. I am teacher in Faculty of Architecture in Brno, and my professional orientation is to conversion of abandoned industrial building and under industrial area and zone and form a factory, and I think it is nice to have some students from different countries, not only domicile student but Erasmus student, to try prepare young generation for this work. And I think it is nice to compare different approach of students from different countries, and result of this project would avoid destruction and salvaguard the heritage. This is why I prepare an international workshop I organize in the moment of start of European project Res Urbanae for university in Brest and Dresden. I invite students from this university and another student, Erasmus student, to work to reinvent this old factory, textile factory, Mosilana. Perhaps, probably, it is last intact textile factory in Brno. As a lot of factory was destroyed and demolished, and this territory is locality is reused for new functions completely, for science, for administrative, but now one private society buy this factory, this Mosilana, last textile factory, and they find to completely demolish this locality and to create here new quarter. But I think it is necessary to keep some documentation, some vestige, some from famous period industrialization in my city in Brno. And in this picture there are some building. For example, this building is building Fritz Tugendhat. This is owner of famous Villa Tugendhat, but my student try to reuse it as a museum, industrialization and patrimoine industrial. And there are another building, for example, this building to dyeing wool material with special character, and I think there are a lot of nice result. And this semester in January we have a symposium in Brest, and with exhibition of this project. And this project, I think, perhaps arrive in Passau, perhaps arrive in future to another country, Dresden, Brno, and Bratislava. It should be understood that the reuse of industrial building is not only a matter of preserving architectural heritage, but also a social and urban imperative. And reusing industrial heritage means strengthening the city in the long term and affirming the reason and meaning which enrich the city's identity. Reusing the industrial heritage is a way of consolidating the city's long history and affirming its reason and meaning which which enrich the living environment and benefit the inhabitant. And the reuse of the heritage of the industrialization era must take its full place in the project, that it tends to give Brno a new lease of life, second life, peut-être in France, redonner la vie, by placing it firmly in European and global dynamic, particularly through encouraging culture development and stimulating creativity. Thank you for attention.
Já to zavřu, nevím, ještě bude někdo, si chce něco.
Díky si, jo.
I have for both. Thank you both for the presentations. Both projects were really interesting. I have a question about the first project. So the castle, from what I understood, is not doesn't have a function now. It's not used as for a certain function. It's just being restored and for studying, for study purpose.
Now is used like a hotel complex, yes, but in reconstruction. Yeah.
And for the second project, so for the workshop that happened, it's only going to be one workshop, or you're going to have other workshop, or just you're going to look for other types of Non, ça va, je comprends le français. Non, je comprends français. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentations. Regarding the first project, I'd like to know if the castle is still open to public visitation. If the castle is still open to public visitation.
Yes, of course. It's open for tourists, yes, and tourism now. Yeah.
Okay, and for the second project, I would like to know if the inhabitants of Brno, I am sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it, Brno, the city, Brno, if they perceive the city, the industrial activities of the city as part of its identity. Like, do they perceive the city as an industrial city? It's part of their heritage and their identity? Okay. Yes. If they understand the city, an industrial city, and they like, oui, je peux le dire en français. Si ces activités industrielles font partie de leur identité, de l'identité de la ville.
We, of course, there are not only Brno, industrial city, but in my country, I think it too, in Europe, there are a lot of industrial heritage. But I think it is kind of period of industrialization, and I try to explain it was medieval city and different character of this medieval city. A big factory was inscribed put in this city, and I think this architecture, industrial architecture, is typical for this period. I think it is. My opinion, I think it is necessary to keep this period, to documentation of this period in city, and inhabitant find this reutilization interesting, and I think it is particular architecture. It is not modern architecture, but it is some detail, some atmosphere, some character to inspire architect, not only architect, inhabitant to reuse it and to keep it.
Okay, thank you. And lastly, I would like to know if there are, yes, probably there are like local policies that encourage the preservation of the industrial heritage. And how does it work? Is it by, I don't know, tax incentives or something like that? To encourage the occupation and the preservation of these industrial buildings?
Yes, in my country there are methodical center for transformation, for reutilization of industrial heritage in north of Moravia, in a city with a lot of heavy industry, and there are a lot of nice example reutilization. I think if you arrive in my country, I propose to go to visit something from Ostrava, from model industrial city. Perhaps you know model industrial city Zlín. It is this is from period of beginning of last century. Tomáš Baťa was fabricant to create factory with boots, with shoes. That perhaps you know Baťa commerce and Baťa factory. It is nice. It is reutilization. It is a lot of museum.
I've got a quite simple question. I just want to be sure if you said so. The industrialization of Brno started with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and why?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Austrian-Hungarian monarchy. It is 300 for this monarchy. Perhaps Brno, my country, is near of Vienna. There are more factories. I think Hungary is agriculture country. I think more agriculture country as Czechoslovakia. Okay.
Hello, Madam. With regard to the second project about the industrial heritage, I have a question: is that have the mode of reuse of your site or in Europe has undergone a change over the period, or is it always the same like a workshop or others? So, to say, have you ever explored the mode like perhaps cooperating with the creative industry or other modes of reuse in Europe of industrial heritage?
I collaborate with another professor from university from Firenze, from Sevilla, from Saarbrücken, from Nancy, Berlin. I think it is we call this collaboration refactory, reutilization factory. I think it is not only project of architect, but a lot of inhabitants like and try to reuse this abandoned building for facility, for life, for I think it is necessary to keep this heritage, this patrimony. It is sufficient for my no.
So that's a function is more perhaps inclined to educational and identical, is that right?
About function, new function, you ask
Function,
me?
yeah.
I think it is not only we leave time of creativity. There are a lot of museums, a lot of creative center, startup, cooperation for people. I think it is different possibility. It is necessary to be inspired by this atmosphere, by this character, to excuse me, to reuse it, to find specific function, new function.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. So I do have a question. You already mentioned that the people from Brno, they are aware that you have to reuse the buildings, the industrial buildings, but do they use the word heritage, industrial heritage, speaking of these buildings? Because being from Moldova, people from my country, they don't see the industrial buildings like a heritage. So do the people from Brno, they see those buildings like a heritage or not? Or just the buildings that have to change the function?
Okay. I try to there are a lot of archaeologists by me here. Our profession is industrial archaeology. It is necessary to discover potential, to discover this potential of this old, not only factory, but I think I think this is not only in Brno. If you try to see another country, for example, Germany, there are a lot of heavy industry in Germany. There are a lot of near of river. It is I think heavy industry, Solferein, Duisburg, and another old factory, old mining, for example, not only heavy industry, but mining. But if production finish for this sector, it was people quit this territory. It is necessary to invite another kind of people, another kind of inhabitant. For example, new research, new intelligent population. It was necessary to create condition for life. It is nice to reuse this building for new function, for new people.
Okay, thank you.
This will no. You need something? Yes? No? Okay.
Okay, we take now a break. Here we will have a long coffee break this morning. We resume at 11. If not at quarter past 11, because at quarter past 11 there will be the next session with Carlos Alvarez Pereira. If you resume at 11, because I will tool for all of us to work. It is an important tool for because of the decisions of the conference, which are published in this book, particularly those related to education, but also policy making. It is important because of the introductory texts, because you have declarations from the organizing institutions, of course, but also I would stress the International Union of Academies, which represents structures in 102 countries in the world, and also of the Humanities European Research Area, which is a network in Europe that puts together 26 public funding structures, like the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology, but the CNRS in France, the CSIC in Spain, the British Academy in the UK, the corresponding structures in all the European, in fact in 25, not all, but in 25 of the European countries, not necessarily all European Union. The UK is no longer European Union, but in any case it's very, very representative. And this network is not financially very strong, but it is the commitment and the strategic vision of the public foundations for science in relation to the humanities. So the fact that they are on board in this is important. And then you will have 3 declarations. The first one is the so-called Lisbon Declaration. It has the particular importance of having been approved by the Portuguese government at the time on behalf of the European Council. You know that in the European Union there is the presidency of the European Union turns every 6 months, goes to a different country. So in the first half of 2021 it was Portugal, and so this became part of the resolutions of the European Union. And then to consolidate that, it was also signed by the government of Slovenia, who got the presidency in the second semester. This is important not only because the 2 governments of that year supported the declaration, but also because you may know that the Portuguese government is center-left and the Slovenian government is a right-wing government. So this means that there is a very large consensus in political terms in Europe about this approach. And then there is an outcome document which has recommendations to all domains, including the communication and so on, to universities. And there is, and I would stress this one, a report of the Youth Forum of the European Humanities Conference. When we organized the European Humanities Conference, we have invited young researchers to organize their own conference besides, and they did so in this way. On one hand, younger researchers participated in the sessions of the conference, so it was not like the junior league separated from the rest. They were participants in the normal academic sessions. But then there was a forum that started before the conference, had meetings during the conference, and then ended up with their own vision for the humanities for the 21st century. So in many respects, it's similar to what the older people were saying, but in many other respects, it's not. And it's a very important document, I would say, very representative, that was approved. Then there are 3 parts. In the end of the book, you will have the participants of the conference. You will see that there were over 90 presentations there. Not all the people wrote as usual in these events. The whole conference will be put online very soon, but it was waiting for the proceedings before being put online. But in the proceedings there are three main parts. The first one are contributions with a vision of the humanities for the 21st century. There's one first paper about Luisa Migliorati, who is a professor at the University of Rome, on the relations between innovation and tradition, talking about the classical humanities, philology, history, and so on, and the new humanities, health humanities, environmental humanities, and so on. There's a second one by Serena Iovino, also an Italian, on the Anthropocene, body, political, environment, culture, and the humanities for the 21st century. So this is clearly a text in line with the so-called new humanities. There's a text on digital humanities by Maria Teresa Cruz from the University of Lisbon, who is an expert on digital humanities and environmental humanities. And there is a text on the potential of Portuguese humanities research and development by Maria Rosário Costa, who was one of the organizers of the conference, and she is the coordinator of humanities in the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology. The second part dealt with the examples of influence and impact of humanities. You have a first paper on the impact of modern archaeology studies in the perception of political spaces in our society, in this case in Cyprus. There's a second paper on Roman roads. It's a classical archaeology study which bridges with contemporary understandings and interests on logistics. There's a paper on digital humanities, but this time on the role of the human component in the digital humanities by Silvia Orlandi. There's one on museums and art. This is written by Zoltan Someiki, who is an expert in aesthetics. Then there are small brief texts. There's a brief report of the session on health humanities. There's a second reference by Silvia Papaloni on health and environmental issues. And then there is a text by Matthias Midel on the project of the global history of humankind that I already mentioned before. Matthias Midel is professor in Leibniz University, and he is the coordinator of this project for CIPS. A summary of the session on humanities and technology by Catherine Jamy from the Collège de France, and a related text by Rosalind Williams from MIT, also on humanities and technology. And finally, a text by John Crowley that is a global reflection on all these issues that I strongly recommend. And the last part touches one important theme of our society today, which is migrations. We have already mentioned this issue here. I think the book is interesting because it offers different perspectives, particularly the two first texts, which are longer. The others are shorter considerations by Vladimir Kolosov, who is an expert in borders and migrations, and by Sandra Ponzanesi, who is also an expert in migrations. But the first two, François Ginjan offers an historical perspective about migrations from early humans until the 20th century, and how variables have changed in that respect. And the text by Tariq Modod talks and discusses the issues of migrations in our society. Here comes one of the authors, and that's the cover, John. And I would show you here two quotations, one by Gabriela Ramos, the Assistant Director General of UNESCO, and one by Madalena Alves, President of FCT, of the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology. I think, as I said, that the relevance in these cases is that this is a tool also in political terms. There is a strong commitment. You will see that the book, for example, has the flags of the two countries that have signed. It has also the logos of a large number of international intellectual organizations, and and it is to be used by all of us in that sense. And I see that Carlos Alvarez Pereira has joined us. So, hi, Carlos. It is very good to see you.
Hi, how are you?
Good,
Sorry,
great.
sorry for not being there with you in person.
So,
Hey, Stephen.
sorry? Wait, I have to, a PDF. Hang on a second, because now it's okay. Carlos, please, the floor is yours. I will just briefly say, before the floor is given to you, let me say a few words, because I was now distracted with these technical issues. Carlos Alvarez Pereira is the Vice President of the Club of Rome. You will all know that the Club of Rome is a leading organization worldwide that has fostered the discussion on sustainable development, and particularly issued many decades ago an important reflection on the so-called limits of growth. We know that when you look at international conferences on issues related to environment, to climate, but also to education, the Club of Rome has played and plays still a very, very important, sometimes backstage, other times also in the stage itself, role. And Carlos has been involved in a various number of projects, particularly more recently in one specific proposal called the fifth element that you will be talking to us about today. Carlos, thank you very much for being with us. I do regret that you could not take the flight, but I'm happy that you are there, and so the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much, Louis, and all dear friends who are there. I'm really sorry not to be with you, but sometimes, life has its own ways that we cannot completely control. So, as said by Luis, I will try to give you a proper understanding of where the Club of Rome is standing now, where we came from, a little bit about where we came from, where we are standing now, and in particular discuss this initiative that we have launched almost a year ago now, called the Fifth Element, that I'm leading at the Club of Rome, and look at that in particular from the perspective of humanities, as you will see, as an invitation to all of you to participate in one way or another. So I'm going to share my screen. So I hope you see that well.
Yes.
So beyond the limits, my question, if I am asked what does the Club of Rome do, in a very short sentence, I say, when we are good, we ask better questions. Not more than that. Not providing all the responses, not much more than asking the questions, but asking questions is already something relevant. And I have the strong feeling that, and you will see what I mean by that later, I have the strong feeling that now the question is, since we are already beyond the limits that Luis was referring to, I will explain also about that. Now our task is a big exercise of learning which is not a global one. It's many different exercises in different contexts. And at the same time, it's a global learning exercise, but that global learning has to take into account, and this connects very well with the topic of the Apheleia seminar this year, that global learning has to understand, we have to understand for that global learning that either we build on what communities are doing at local levels, or we basically are cheating ourselves. That's my strong feeling. But let's start with a question that we asked 50 years ago. I mean, last year it was the 50th anniversary of the publication of this book, which had a significant impact. It sold millions of copies of a book which is a thriller, not a novel. So it's even more varied, you know. And what was the question then? You know, the question was, does prosperity or could prosperity lead to collapse? Could material prosperity, the type of we were used at the time, and it did get only worse in the sense of how much we connect our well-being, or we think our well-being is connected to material prosperity, well, could that lead to collapse of civilization? And the question is not a mandate, or is not the response to the question was not a prophecy. Actually, one of the things which happened with the book is that it created a lot of controversy. It sold millions of copies, as I said. It moved the debates in many ways, and especially at the beginning, many politicians, particularly in Europe, but also in the US, were sensitive to the question. But it was basically misunderstood. The main message was basically misunderstood, because it focused on the fact that the book was framed as a prophecy of apocalypse, you know, doomsday. We were at the time labeled by some as doomsday people, you know, while it was not at all. It was meant, the book was meant to open the space of possibilities. For sure, what was done in the book was to present a number of simulations, of scenarios for the future, from 1972 into the future. Scenarios derived from the elaboration of a global modeling exercise on the 5 variables that you see on the screen, the evolution of these 5 variables at the global level. So very simplistic model, of course, very imperfect. But we were in the late 60s, early 70s. You can imagine, I mean, the kind of computer support that could be used at the time, you know. Very simplistic model, but still, in a way, very helpful to explore scenarios. And the basic, the standard run in the jargon of the limits to growth, now we call that business as usual. And the continuation, which was basically the continuation with the same parameters of the model that we had at the time, were indeed showing that we could have, by the middle of this century, in which we already are, so not so far enough from now, cost of human civilizations in terms of population, in terms of exhaustion of natural resources. Actually, a collapse fed by the combination of 2 big factors, the exhaustion of natural resources and the increase in pollution. And out of the 13 scenarios which were in the book, many of them presented the same pattern at different moments, different ways, but still this matter of collapse, this beware we might go into collapse. But, and that's a big but, some of them showed the possibility of stabilization, the possibility of reconciling, you know, our human well-being with what we call now the planetary boundaries. In any case, the book was put aside let's be honest, we had it created the reputation of the Club of Rome, but also for good and bad, because many people started saying that, these people from the Club of Rome, they are, as I said, doomsdayers, and we shouldn't listen to them at all, all sorts of conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are not new, as you know, started emerging about who is the Club of Rome and if we are part of the hidden government of the world, in the dark and things like that. And all kinds of false accusations were made. So, for instance, that we predicted the end of oil by the year 2000, which we never did, It was not a book of predictions. But anyway, all that was quite effective in putting the book aside. Where we now, unfortunately, we could argue that things have evolved, and actually it has been done several times since 1972. Number of people, not the Club of Rome itself, but other researchers, have assessed against the scenarios of the limits of growth, where are we? And this assessment has been basically showing that we were following the path of this business as usual scenario that I showed. So we didn't move the course of the world. On the contrary, there was substantial acceleration, especially from the moment that a number of what we call quote unquote neoliberal, I don't like the adjective, but neoliberal globalization took place and became stronger. The path of these well-being associated to material prosperity became even stronger and faster. And where we are now is that, sorry to say, the concept of sustainable development, which was crafted as you know, in the 80s, and officially voted by the UN in 1997, the human development compatible with the planet and the future generations, that it is up to today basically an oxymoron, a contradiction in terms. Nobody has seen yet that animal called sustainable development. And this is, again, a very simplistic way of representing it, but very telling. Colleagues in the Club of Rome, Mathis Wackernagel and Bill Rees, developed the concept of ecological footprint and checked against the Human Development Index created by the UN and mixing GDP per capita and levels of health and education in countries. And as you see, the dots here represent countries. No one of them is inside the rectangle of sustainable development, because basically where you have high levels of HDI, you have also very high levels of ecological footprint. And where you have low levels of ecological footprint, you have also low levels of HDI, and the trajectory of the countries moves, in this. If we were making an animation here about how China has evolved in this graph, we would see it moved from here from the lower left quadrant to the upper right quadrant by passing sustainable development. And interestingly enough, some countries are close to have this balance in this very simplistic, again, representation. Some countries are close to that, definitely closer than many others, to this balance of HDI, high HDI, low footprint, a measure in number of Earths that we need to sustain our lifestyle. But they are not typically the countries we look at when we think of who is more advanced in terms of sustainability. Maybe you could have the idea that the Nordic countries are ahead. Well, not in terms of ecological footprint, definitely not. But that's interesting already, and again, connecting with the topic of the seminar, that's also already saying that in places where you are typically not looking at, maybe they are funding pathways to well-being compatible with the biosphere. Nowadays, And that's interesting because these two quotes from Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, are distant 3 years from each other and are so different, you know. The first one was in Lisboa at the Web Summit. I was there, and he basically said, "Oh, you know, in the last decades we had a lot of growth, economic growth, people getting out of poverty, scientific technological development. All that is positive, except for some collateral damage, climate change and growing inequality." To be honest, I almost jumped on my seat when I heard the word collateral applied to that, to climate change and growing inequality, which are existential threats, you know, self-inflicted existential threats. Interestingly enough, if you listen to Antonio Guterres now, is much more radical, and it started being so already end of 2020 with this discourse on the state of the planet at Columbia University. Humanity is waging war on nature, this is suicidal. One could figure out, one could wonder about the reasons for such a shift. It's not that in 2017 everything was okay, and in 2020 everything was broken. The state of the planet has not changed so much, but definitely the perception and the expression by Antonio Guterres has changed a lot. Probably there is no coincidence in the fact that what happened in the middle, of course, is the onset of COVID. COVID, the pandemic, changed many perceptions, I would say. But this is where we are today. I usually express this in this way, we need to find pathways towards something which is at the same time a state or multiplicity of states or multiplicity of pathways towards equitable human well-being. So well-being for all humans, but also all non-humans. So equitable human well-being within a healthy biosphere. Taking care of the planet as much as taking care of ourselves, and overcoming this fundamental separation between the two. This fundamental separation of ourselves from nature, because we are actually not separated, but we pretend we are. And typically, until now, the framing has been, let's develop, quote unquote, let's develop countries, and then after that we take care. The traditional framings of sustainability have been very much built around this image of a triangle, where you have economy, society, and environment, and economy is at the top of the triangle, implicitly but strongly meaning we take care of the economy first, then if the economy is working well, we take care of people, and then if everything is going well, we take care of the environment. This is part of the framing of modernity, as I will mention later. And this is extremely misleading because we are not separate. As COVID, for instance, has become even more obvious. But of course, climate change is making obvious that we are not separate. But the point is we don't know how to make this. And we have to recognize with humility that we don't have the responses on how to make this idea, this abstract concept of equitable human well-being within a healthy biosphere, how to make it real. So in a way, I think we are in the similar situation to this young lady, to this girl, in this, graphic representation that I usually put without saying what it is, where does it come from, and very rapidly somebody in the room guesses appropriately that it is Alice, going across the looking glass, and so I think we are a little bit in this kind of situation. We are going through a threshold a threshold of criticality, and we don't exactly know what is on the other side, sorry to say. And pretty much as Alice, we will find things which will be familiar, but a lot of things which will not be familiar, or which will, or the things and, beings looking familiar will behave in a completely unfamiliar way. For me, this is a call to exploration, but let's recognize as well that to many people, this is frightening. We have, culturally speaking, it looks like our drive for exploration, which has been very much a characteristic of human societies since the beginning, seems not to be so strong today, at least in the so-called quote-unquote developed countries, where we feel that, we need to know what is coming. We need to know the pathway. Maybe we have to change a lot, but let's define first where we are going, and please, I need a map, and to the future. Well, maybe we'll pretend that we have a map. Sometimes I make the analogy that we are lost in the jungle, in the middle of the jungle, but we have a street map of New York, and we pretend that the street map of New York is useful to find your way in the middle of the jungle. Sometimes it looks like that. Let's put the street map of New York aside. Let's recognize we are lost, and then let's explore together. That's a completely different approach. And by the way, this is not exactly new to the Club of Rome, because almost nobody knows about this book, No Limits to Learning, which was published in 1979. But it tells how strong was the humanistic perspective of the Club of Rome since the very beginning. The Club of Rome is not to be reduced to the limits to growth and to this idea of, we build models, we build computerized models to find out what will happen in the future. That's part of what we do, but there was, since the very beginning, and particularly due to the founder of the Club of Rome, Aurelio Peccei, a strong humanistic perspective since the very beginning. And from that perspective, the Club of Rome realized very early that, the limits to growth is not changing the course of things. What is missing? Aurelio started talking about the human gap, the difference between our capacity to act and our capacity to understand the consequences of our actions and to deal with them, with those consequences. And this book is subtitled Bridging the Human Gap, that human gap. So it addressed already the challenges of humanity as a big exercise in learning to overcome that human gap, which is very much product of our epistemology, of the dominant epistemology we are using. I will come back to that later. And how to get beyond that epistemology. And he got into that so much that in 1994, the last book co-written by Aurelio Peccei and Daisaku Ikeda, a Japanese philosopher of a Buddhist background, was titled Before It Is Too Late, and was claiming for a human revolution. Not a political one, a cultural one, actually a revolution of the mindsets, of the mentalities, of realizing, I would say, what they were talking about in that book is an epistemological or epistemic revolution. So again, from a deeply humanistic perspective. That was already there. And this is why today we are continue to build on this humanistic dimension. We published in last year, on occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Limits to Growth, we published a book titled Earth for All, which is about what policies would make possible to reconcile, human well-being and the planetary boundaries. But that one is very much of this school of thought of modeling, global modeling, and producing recommendations for policymakers. This book, Limits and Beyond, explores what happened at the time, where are we today, and where do we go from now, and again formulates the exercise that we have to face as an exercise in learning, and learning in the deep sense. How do we learn what we already know? Well, learning here has to be taken as changing, not as acquiring the conscious understanding of something, but as changing our behaviors from the knowledge we acquire. And by the way, that knowledge might be conscious or might be unconscious. Our intelligence is much larger than just the rational mind. And our perceptions, we make sense of reality through frameworks that we apply to our perceptions, as I will say later. And then we can realize that the space of possibilities we have is much more open than the ways that what comes out from the ways we think, usually, conventionally. And this is why the book is dedicated to Donella Meadows, Lynn Margulis, and all persons struggling to open this space of possibilities, to learn what we already know. That we know, I'm not talking about what we know because the Club of Rome made it knowledgeable. I'm talking about what we know since the beginning of times. Many times what we see today is that modern science is just rediscovering ancient knowledge which is still alive in the ways in which originary peoples live, still today, after thousands of years. So let's not forget that a lot of the knowledge we need and a lot of the learning we need to achieve comes from reconnecting with these wisdom of how to be part of nature instead of separated from it. In the Club of Rome, we are trying to navigate this difficult space with multiple threads. And it's not so easy to understand, even for the members of the Club of Rome, what is it? A very strange animal, for sure, but also an animal which tries to do untypical things. And this is what enables us to ask better questions, because we have this cocktail, these ingredients are very different in nature. This strong thread on humanism, consciousness, learning, and a multiplicity of worldviews. We have the ideas coming from systems thinking, which is actually a space with many different schools, not only one. So systems thinkers have come in many different flavors. We have, of course, this tradition of global modeling and the access to policymakers, but our organization is a place where people meet people coming from so different spaces, practitioners in business and finance, in education, science, civil society, politics as well. And then we started 1 year ago, so we do plenty of things in the Club of Rome. You can look at the website, but 1 year ago we started this program, which is connecting very much with what you are discussing in this seminar, Massao, connecting with these ideas of the human revolution, which were there in the 80s in the work of Aurelio Peccei, but also many others, connecting with what the Black consciousness movement started in South Africa in the late 60s, connecting with what the pedagogies of liberation have been trying to do for decades. I'm thinking of Paulo Freire or the Reggio Emilia movement in Italy and others, and many others before them, to try and connecting with what we understand about systems change, trying to do this completely crazy exercise of catalyzing the emergence of a human revolution. The fifth element.earth is our website, recently launched, so you can also have a look at that. And what is our approach, which I think might be useful to discuss in particular in this context, the context of your seminar. Our approach is to liberate the creative potential of learning, to realize that probably the people who learn easiest are those who have no option but to learn, the helpless and disempowered, you know, because it's not we in the as part of the elites, I mean, the members of the Club of Rome, we are no doubt privileged people if you look at the world of today, and we often talk about these issues, but many people around the world, not so visible, and maybe the lack of visibility is might be a blessing in some sense, but many people on the ground, many people in communities, in local communities, are living the challenges as existential, not talking about existential challenges, but living them and finding their own pathways to overcome them. And this is probably from whom we could learn something. At the same time, it's a bet on respecting all cultures and threads of knowledge. Ancient wisdom, as I said, and modern science, all cultures and all worldviews, which is, let's be honest, very difficult. Very difficult. You have, we have been for such a long time living in this epistemology of universalism, and there is an objective way of addressing the issues of creating scientific knowledge, that it's from that perspective, when you are embedded in that perspective, it's very difficult to engage in fruitful exchanges with worldviews which are still alive, but so different. But that's part of what I think we have to do. From the realization that we don't have access to reality, we receive perceptions from reality and we make sense of them through frameworks of interpretation. But the perceptions, the reality is overwhelming compared to the perceptions we receive. The perceptions we receive through all pieces, all elements, all our body are overwhelming compared to what we can frame rationally, what we can understand at a rational level. And hence, necessarily, these gaps between reality perception frameworks and conscious understanding create blind spots. And the blind spots are big. And in a way, when I say the Club of Rome, when we are good, we ask better questions, is hopefully those questions eliminate our blind spots. I don't think we can eliminate all the blind spots. There is no way to know if we could exhaust the list of blind spots we have. But what makes a big, big difference is that at least we're able to know that we have blind spots. And then from there, maybe we could learn. Needless to say, and I'm sure you have been talking about that, this requires work which goes way, way beyond the borders of disciplines, as framed typically in higher education, well, in education in general, but in particular in higher education and research, as those disciplines and the borders of the disciplines make that people have certain established and generally rigid frameworks within those disciplines, and make that the people, the scholars, the experts, are not ready to work out of their frameworks, and hence the blind spots of each of these frameworks are there and are not addressed, and become, with time, they could even become bigger. this is related to, again, to epistemology very much. It's interesting that more or less at the same time that Aurelio Peccei was talking about the human gap, Gregory Bateson was talking about the human gap. He didn't use that expression. But this, Peccei was talking about the difference between the capacity to act and the capacity to understand consequences of our actions. Bateson was talking about the difference between how nature works and the way people think. Epistemology again. An epistemology which should be much more, should take much more care of what the physicist Richard Feynman was saying, that you cannot cheat nature. Actually, this is what we pretend to do all the time. We're trying all the time to cheat nature, and we never get it. And the consequences of pretending we can, are what we have today. So a strong element of, it's not that we explain this to everybody who gets involved in the fifth element, but for this particular context, I think it makes sense to mention that when talking about the background behind the fifth element is certainly a shift of epistemology from this one, which is still the dominant epistemology of modernity, of Western modernity, if you wish, yes, but still to be discussed. Many elements of this modernity actually come, I would say, from elsewhere, but that's another discussion. But definitely it has been what has dominated, in this period from the 16th, 17th century, which has been a period in which the world shifted towards Western domination. This kind of epistemology has been as a companion, this shift to dominance of Western thinking, but especially of Western power in the world, in which separation, in my view, is the key element, and this fantasy of individualism, this fantasy of individual supremacy, which ends up being a form of oppression, a form of self-oppression. I think there is a lot to say about what I call the unreasonable effectiveness of modernity, because let's not cheat ourselves. That framework of modernity has been extremely effective in changing the world. You look at the acceleration of history in many ways in the last 3 centuries, it's sort of amazing, And I wonder a lot about why modernity is so effective, because being based on separation, while life with a capital L is based on relationality, on the contrary of separation, how the hell is, modernity so effective? And my view is that there is a sort of a self-reinforcing loop, which leads from separation to control, to the anxiety to control. That's very much a characteristic of the dominant systems of today, that we want to control nature, we want to control people, we want to control the future, we want basically to control everything because of our fears. This anxiety for control comes from our fears, and those fears are reinforced by putting separation at the center. If we are separate, if we are isolated, it makes sense to be fearful. And of course, this anxiety of control leads to exploitation of territories, of landscapes. I know that the landscape perspective is one that Luis and colleagues have been working on very much. Well, we want also to control landscapes, instead of living with the landscapes. We want to exploit natural resources. We want to exploit people, begin exploiting people. And that creates a lot of tensions and crises. But one characteristic of this self-reinforcing loop is that at each level of crisis, we add another level of separation and abstraction. I mean, this would be for a separate talk on this idea that modernity finds ways, you know, to every time there is a crisis, challenging the concepts, the fundamental concepts of modernity. It finds ways to create a new level of abstraction and then go in this runaway, continue going in this runaway evolution, you know, which is sort of blind and leads us to the collapse, in my view. And I think it's pretty obvious now, but it looks like we have to do something else, try something else to escape from this spiral, you know, of separation and abstraction, you know. So what we are in a way promoting, I put this, the fifth element, but please don't take me wrong. We have no pretension to say that this epistemology has been created by the fifth element. No, it's everywhere. It's the epistemology which is in many ways have been in human culture since the very beginning, still dominant in many living cultures all around the world, in the cultures of originary peoples, but also you can see many elements of that in Asian epistemologies, in African epistemologies, in Ubuntu, which has now become, you know, a fashionable word. So we're not inventing anything here. We are just sensing that other epistemologies also exist in which relationships are key, in which we are not separated, in which interdependencies are the center, in which the world has never been empty, always been full of life. We just decided not to respect all lives that were not humans or not white or not Western, but also an epistemology in which creativity and learning takes the place of this anxiety for control, and an epistemology in which liberation comes from relationships. You know, many times what we are seeing today is that people claim for freedom. Many people who are angry at the consequences of climate change and proposals to tackle climate change say we should free, but free in the sense of consuming, freedom as consumption. While I think we have to promote the idea that freedom comes from relationships and from creativity rather than from consumption. You know? So this is the grounding for what we do in the fifth element, and I will go into some of the things we have learned in the year during which we have been operating, you know. But let me add that what makes, in my view, a big difference is our consideration, this humanistic perspective. And I know it's a bit tricky to say our perspective is deeply humanistic while we are saying, but we don't want the human at the center of our epistemology. Well, because it's humanistic in the sense of human cultures since the beginning of times, which have been always relational, in particular in the relationship, not only among humans, but with all living beings, with living and non-living beings. By the way, the border between what is living and what is not living is a very tricky one, but also the relationship with time. So it's humanistic in the sense of let's reconnect with our own humanity, which is not the reductionistic version of modernity. And it's very much about overcoming the sense of separation. So many times we hear, implicitly or not, even in discourses to promote social ecological transformations, we hear this message of people are problematic. You know? People, because you know, people are ignorant. They don't understand climate change. They are in denial of climate change. They vote for Trump. or simply there are too many people, on Earth, and every time I hear that, I ask, but who is in excess? Because normally when people say there are too many people on Earth, they are never saying we are in excess. They're saying others are in excess. So all these ideas which are connected to the idea of separation, the fantasy of exclusion, us versus them, or even this new perspective of, but you know what, now that we are creating artificial intelligence, something called artificial intelligence, very abusive terminology, we can get rid of humans because the machines will do our work much better than us. All that, in my view, is a terrible framing because they create more layers and more polarization, more separation among humans. So one of the things we do is we trust the fundamental humanity of everybody, and that's from where we could imagine liberating the potential for learning. So in this year, and I'm finishing my presentation now, it's the last slides, although they're a bit dense, but what have we sensed in the year because we are having meetings, presentations, discussions, etc. The first is that there are lots of dissonances going on. People are really, we are inviting people as people in our conversations, not as stakeholders. And people are generally aware, very much aware of the differences between what they often have to do in their roles of stakeholders or public representatives or whatever organizations and what they actually feel as humans. And those dissonances are interesting because, of course, it's a contradiction, which can lead to frustration, to cynicism, but also maybe to the explosion of new energy. How could we build on those dissonances to shift, to make change happen, to make learning happen, A big one is, as much as many people are working for better future in which collaboration, which will realize that collaboration is a much more important feature of life than competition, but we still live in a world which is competitive. How do you live with that dissonance, And a fundamental thing that we have also sensed is that the issues we face are very much related with the phenomenon of dispossession, of dispossessing people, but not only people, living beings as well, from their autonomy. And all beings are autonomous. The more we interrogate this about, living beings which are not human, the more we ask better questions on that, we discover that all living beings have communication, have ways of communicating among themselves. I would say even that maybe if we say that we are humans are sort of emergent properties from bacteria, which we are the initial element of life, well, bacteria have their own autonomy, and as shown is as shown during COVID, we were talking about very clearly about the intelligence of virus to mutate, many times. Well, let's recognize then that all beings have autonomy and at the same time are completely interdependent, But dispossession is the opposite of recognizing the autonomy and the interdependency, is to make people dependent on power. So that's a very big topic. To us, building on decades, a couple of centuries of systems thinking, but also building on, again, so much ancient knowledge, we are developing an approach to systemic change in which we feel the learning that I was talking about will ultimately happen through mutual metamorphosis. We live in a culture which is where relationality is still there but has been put aside, in which separation has become the dominant framing, and with separation, narcissism, the extreme versions of egos have become dominant. So we have forgotten that the grounding for our health and our well-being, and of course the health and the well-being of the biosphere, is to take care of relationships. If we reintroduce that in the process of learning, in the process of transformation, we think that that process will only happen if we engage into mutual metamorphosis in many different contexts. And that's an invitation also to you to explore some of those contexts, in a context inside economic ecosystems, in context between different worldviews, in context between different continents. How could this idea, very abstract for now, very abstract, but building on something that science has analyzed in very practical way, in particular evolutionary biology. I was mentioning Lynn Margulis before, her idea that symbiosis and symbiogenesis are fundamental mechanisms of evolution. Well, symbiogenesis is exactly a mutual metamorphosis in which two species not only live together, but at some point give birth to together. So we know that that by the way that change, that deeper learning cannot happen if we don't start from a point of criticality, situation of criticality and fractures, which is where we are. We are aware that a lot of the new learnings happen in spaces, in places, in place-based evolutions. So communities, this is what we call self-organization at the edge and emergence from new seeds, not from the center of the system. Karl Deutsch said long ago that power is the ability not to have to learn anything. I would say power is the ability not to have to learn anything except what it needs to learn to keep power. So don't expect the transformations to come from the center of the system, but rather from the margins, in a process in which the seeds can ultimately resonate and give birth to new patterns through process. And these are metaphors, of course, of pollination, symbiosis, and metamorphosis. Let's say metaphors coming from our understanding of some biological processes, but for which there are good arguments to say that they could use for social processes, in my view, but I'm open to discussion. And the very last one, I started saying what we do is to try to ask better questions. So in the fifth element, basically we only ask questions. Again, don't think that we pretend to have the responses. And this is why this is an invitation to all of you to be part of, or to be inspired, or to be provoked, or whatever. But we are not going to find the recipes. We're just provoking for people to engage in processes of deep learning through different questions. I mean, questions which are typically not asked by others. And I put here only 4 of them. We are plenty of them, This unreasonable effectiveness of modernity is something which is really astonishing, outstanding, and a big obstacle, of course, for transformations towards scenarios in which we reconcile at last with life. And in my view, this transformation towards reconciliation with life cannot have the meanings, so many meanings, starting with what is a good life, what is success, what is positive, how do we, attribute value, how do we measure success, how do we evaluate risks, and many things like that. The meanings shift, and then for that we need more relational worldviews to come back. Are they coming back? And they have been there. They have been there, and they are in all cultures. Even in the Western cultures, we can find elements of relational worldviews, but they have been, of course, very much censored or put aside. Of course, in this context, in general, in the conversations we are having within the Bridges Coalition for Sustainability Science and in other spaces, we are asking, and what is the role of research and higher education in putting knowledge creation upside down? I say upside down because we have to start from other questions, not from the typical questions that are asked within the strict and rigid borders of disciplines. And last but not least, because in this question, I really don't know, it's just exploring, navigating. How could we weave artistic expressions, as an artist friend of mine says, but not art as we know it? How could we weave artistic practices, ancient wisdom, and modern science together for social transformation? I know these are big questions, sorry, but as I said, this is our mission, to ask questions. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you, Luis, for inviting me to be part of this seminar, and sorry again for not being there.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And let me just we had a very interesting presentation, and I would like to ask the floor if anyone wants to raise questions. Yes, Shuban. Who has the microphone? Carlos, as the sound in the auditorium is not good for you, I will listen to the questions and repeat them, okay, more or less. Traduttore.
First of all, thank you very much, sir, for your meaningful presentation on this global learning. As you mentioned that we are living in a competitive world, and you mentioned about learning and knowledge. So I would just like to know, like, if learning really makes you a learned person.
Does learning make you a learned person?
Like you said, knowledge. So knowledge, like in the sense of memory, and there's something called understanding, where we require philosophy. So like vis-a-vis with the competitive world that we see around us, is learning really important to be a learned person?
In this complex world, is learning really important to become a learned person? Did you get the question, Carlos?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Maybe we ask if there are one or two questions. Yes, please, Camille.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. My question is regarding the epistemology, modernity versus fifth elements.
The question is about the epistemology of modernity versus fifth elements.
And especially regarding the competitions and also collaborations that you talk about in fifth elements. So in epistemology of modernity, it's more related to realistic international relation theories, as I understood.
Realistic cooperation theories.
And the fifth element, epistemology, made me think a lot to liberalism theories of international relation. But how do you get the collaboration without individual interest in the fifth element's epistemology? Thank you.
And I take one more now in this round. Shanti.
Thank you for the presentation. Just one question that I think in a global context will have an impact or would like to be answered in terms of getting the global community and the integration. Do you guys have you thought of doing it holistically? A holistic approach to integrating all of these theories or ways of doing things in a global context, however, holistically.
Can you rephrase this, Shanti? I couldn't understand very well.
In terms of a global context of integrating the whole concept of modernity or all of these other theories, have they tried to think of doing it holistically?
Do you consider using an holistic approach, bringing in the different theories? Okay, we stop now. It's already 3 questions, then we can resume. Carlos, if you wish.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to all people in the audience, in particular to the people who have asked the questions. So about becoming a learned person, I think we have to fundamentally rethink this category of what is a learned person. I'm using learning in this learning as an equivalent of changing. As I said, not as an equivalent of having acquired certain knowledge and on many things. You know, we in the conventional academic way. Does the academia produce learned persons in the sense of persons having changed to and being able to face the challenges we live today? I'm far from sure about that. This is, we should get into, but it's, I mean, again, this is for another discussion, but we need to get into the idea of, and I'm not a fan of that expression, but the idea of levels of learning. And at what level do we need to learn today? And you can find elements on that, on the theory of levels of learning in Gregory Bateson as well as other authors, you know. My favorite example is about energy transition, you know, and the idea that there is a level 0 of learning in which we as a society learned how to use fossil fuels, you know, for our benefit. And that requires a lot of learning, a lot of knowledge, the development of knowledge, a lot of very specialized, quite narrow way of learning, you know, the technical things around fossil oils and their exploitations. But it's level 0 because once we learn that, and in many ways through academia, higher education in general, people are taught one level of response, we stay at that level of response. And this is where we are. We learned how to learn fossil fuels, and we have not yet learned anything else. Another level of learning would be to say, okay, we have another response for that question about energy. What kind of energy sources do we use? Which is renewable energies. Great. That's another level of learning. That's learning a different response to the same question. But it doesn't require a fundamentally different approach to the topic. It is very different because potentially, for instance, the architecture of renewable energy could be completely distributed, and it requires all kinds of other technical elements. But what we are talking about in the fifth element is more about asking questions going into an even deeper level of learning, which would be, in this case, why do we need energy consumption for? And that requires another way of being learned, of being a learned person. And maybe that way of being learned is not necessarily achieved through going to the modern conventional institutions of higher education. Maybe many of the people in the originary peoples already know some of the responses to the questions we are not asking, like what makes well-being and health, and we know since the beginning of times, but we know also from modern science that what makes health and well-being is the quality of our relationships, not the quality of our technical infrastructure. I mean, it's a simplistic response, of course. So the process of becoming a learned person, I think now, today, if I have to answer this question today, would have a lot to do with this idea of reconnecting with our own humanity and reconnecting with life, with the richness and complexity of life, reconnecting with the humility of recognizing that we don't know. Basically, we don't know, and we will probably not be able to know. As parts of life, we will probably not be able to know everything about life, and much less to control. How can we achieve collaboration without individual interest? That's a very good question, because this collaboration versus competition thing is a big obstacle. How do we achieve that mothers take care of their children? Do we teach mothers to take care of their children? Is there individual interest in that? I think taking care of others is at least as much as competition in our nature. If again, when modern science dares to ask that question, instead of assuming that life works based on competition, instead of assuming reductionistic readings of Darwin, and that's pretty much what Lynn Margulis and others did, Yes, there is competition for sure, but let's question that is all, if that is all, which is there. When you ask the question and you look at what is the role of collaboration in the evolution of life, and not collaboration for individual interest, or not necessarily, you realize how strong is the drive to take care of others. So I think it is very much possible. We just have to reconnect with people as people again, And I know individual interest, we have been for centuries trained in the idea that we don't do anything without individual interest. We have been for such a long time reduced to the idea of homo economicus, that we forget that the most important things in our lives, we do them without individual interest. Is love, friendship built on individual interest? I leave the question there. And regarding the last question about an holistic approach to bring together the different theories, I'm very cautious about that. We are not in this, the ambition of the fifth element. By the way, why the name fifth element? Just to make clear, it's at the same time a tribute to ancient knowledge. You know, this idea that there are 4 elements in many traditions, not in the Chinese one, but Chinese have 5 elements, which are a bit different. But in many traditions, there is earth, wind, air, and fire as 4 elements. But there is this knowledge, this intuition that the 4 elements are necessary but not sufficient, that they do not create life without a quintessential element, which is mysterious, which is energy, living energy, life itself, qi for the Chinese, etc. We are using that name, that expression, because it's not ours. It's, you know, human heritage of every human. You know, it comes from so many different traditions that anybody owns this expression, but we are not aiming at creating a unified. I'm very cautious about unification. We are not aiming to create a unified theory. We are not even aiming at creating a theory. We're aiming unified or not. We're aiming at sensing what is happening, sensing what is emerging, and find out if there are ways to help that emergence, and to see if that emergence, what is emerging in so many different places, if these places could learn from each other, could pollinate. And it's the opposite of scaling up or finding a recipe, one universal recipe. I don't believe in universalism, because I think life is always contextual. If you look at the history of science, yes, science has elaborated some ideas that we call laws. From the scientific point of view, these laws are okay until they are not, you know, and physics has been very good at understanding that a paradigm is valid only in certain conditions, and when it doesn't work, you find another paradigm. So it has been incredibly self-critical about its own theories. But in any case, it looks like there are very few principles in physics and chemistry that we could call universal, but then, quote unquote, universal. But then life is always extremely diverse and extremely different from one place to another, and always contextual. So we are not aiming to a unifying theory. We don't say that a unified theory cannot exist. I don't know. We are agnostic on that, but this is not our aiming. Our aiming is to learn from the incredible richness of what people can do in their own contexts, and how that could be part, again, of the human heritage for everybody.
Thank you, Carlos. We have at least one more. Ana Isabel. Queres falar aqui? Não, tu estás aí, fala que eu... É, por isso. Não, fala daí, fala daí.
I need my glasses.
Devagarinho, que é para eu ir dizendo.
Ah, tu queres... É comprido.
Então falas aqui para se ver. Este microfone chega ali a ela.
Eu vou.
Espera lá. Aí embaixo. Okay, Carlos, you can see. In this case, you can see who is asking you.
Hi, I'm Anna from University of Lisbon. I'm going to talk this afternoon, and my talk connects a lot with yours. And I have a rather difficult question. but I'm sure you're going to give me some insight into this because I've been wondering. A very recent article from Nature for 2021 used a number of international evaluation tests in school to measure learning, the progressive learning across the globe. And they have come out with a not surprising result of that more learning, meaning that the enrollment, exponential enrollment of pupils and the reforms in education from 2000 and 2017 have been enormous across the globe. However, through the evaluation tests, it shows that more learning has not been equivalent to more knowledge. Meaning that the knowledge average in terms of the international tests, and there are 12 different tests involved in these among peers, teams, PISA, etc., for there are continental and regional tests as well. So they've all shown that knowledge hasn't increased in terms of the learning that has expanded. And my question is, what is the role of mass schooling in your fifth element epistemology? What would be the role of mass schooling in your, what's the role of this monstrous, resilient system of learning in your fifth element epistemology? That's it.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who wants to ask anything?
Well, that's it.
So.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Who was going to speak? Who was speaking? Carlos. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Carlos. I thought it was someone else. Go ahead, please. You can reply.
And there is also the question by Stephen, right on the...
I didn't see. Okay.
Is it necessary on the chat? It is necessary to co-develop a transdisciplinary lingua franca to achieve the aims of the fifth element, right? So, regarding this evaluation of learning and knowledge and the role of mass schooling, I'm not sure if it is already clear, but the learning I'm talking about is one which is not necessarily happening in schools. So I'm making a big difference between learning and teaching and education, at least the conventional way. So what do we need? I'm curious about these. I don't know this paper published in Nature. I would be curious to look at that, because what I know is that typically the kind of assessments we do are based on measurements which are deemed to be universal, again, universality coming back, and are framed in an epistemology of productivity and performance. And how do we make that all kids master some literacies in their own language, foreign language, mathematics, whatever, and a certain number of prescribed matters, and knowledge. The learning I'm talking about is fundamentally different from that. Because education and the industrialization of education has been one of the powerful instruments of modernity. Part of the explanation on the effectiveness of modernity is that we have implemented these systems of massive industrialized education, to teach people something and to teach them at that level zero level of learning, so that we don't enable them to question what they have learned at school, later find by their own ways their other responses. So I'm very skeptical about the approaches saying, oh, the issue we have is that we have to go to educate massively the people in the territories where there is not yet an educational system comparable to the ones we have in the industrialized countries. And I'm not saying, of course, that education is not necessary. What I'm very cautious is about, yes, but learning of under what kind of epistemology. And what is interesting here is that the pedagogies which have been trying something different from the conventional one being that education is about transmitting specialized knowledge from one generation to the next, and that knowledge is established, and there is a scientific objective way of establishing what is knowledge and what is not. And there are experts to validate centrally validate what is knowledge, what is valid knowledge and what is not. And then education is about transmitting that knowledge to the next generation. I am very skeptical of that system, especially in the industrialized way it has been applied, to give the capacity to society, to people and society at large to learn what we need to learn right now. And in that sense, we are collaborating with other organizations, and one of them is the Learning Planet Institute, which has been questioning for years the ways we learn today. But before us, long before us, a number of people in the field of pedagogy tried to question that, and tried to build other perspectives, alternatives, where the innate capacity of humans to learn, of each individual, and I would say the innate capacity of each individual, of each kid to be a systems thinker, how to build from there, from those innate capacities that are to a large extent repressed or put aside in the usual framing of education today, the disciplinary one, reductionistic, mechanistic one, And those pedagogies, which I call the pedagogies of liberation, started 1 century ago. You have names as Vygotsky, as Montessori, Steiner, Reggio Emilia, Loris Malaguzzi, Paulo Freire, that I mentioned before. We have been working from a completely different angle of how to create the conditions for kids to learn by themselves. In my view, and the big issue is that these are only, still today, these alternative pedagogies are only a drop in the ocean, of a system which is about industrialized education, and not giving to people, the proper conditions for them to learn by themselves, which some people do. And a colleague in the Club of Rome, John Gilmore, developed the LEAP schools in South Africa, in the poorest spaces in South Africa, in the townships, to show that everybody is capable of learning. So rather than mass schooling, I would go for learning informed by the pedagogies of liberation. Another partner of us, Karima Kadawi and the Tamkin Foundation, are now engaging a process of metamorphosis of the whole educational system in Morocco from completely different perspectives compared to the conventional ones. That's where I think lies the future of education, and from where we could have hope about developing our capacity to learn in a deeper sense. Then regarding the question by Stephen, a lingua franca, transdisciplinary lingua franca, that's a very good question. How could, I mean, we cannot, of course, we cannot ignore that disciplines exist, you know, and how much has been done by disciplines, the different disciplines, you know. And we cannot ignore the languages that have been developed by the different disciplines. And these terrible obstacle, which is different languages, meaning, by the way, I mean, might be the same language, but that's already a limitation. Because if we all speak in English, as we do, you know, a sort of inevitable, but English is already a framework, a limiting framework. Other languages make different interpretations of the perceptions of the reality, you know, and there is the richness in itself in looking at the perspective and the richness, of course, of the cultures which are much closer to life and have typically developed a much richer language to interact with nature than we have in English. You know? So how do we deal with this multiplicity of languages, of verbal languages, but also of specific and specialized languages in which one word in the same language, in English, one word means different things in different disciplines. Again, it's pretty much related to the question on the possibility of the emergence of a unified theory. I would say to Stephen, I don't know, but my first guess is no, that's not what we need. Because we need to realize anyway that languages are limited instruments. I mean, there is an amazing capacity of humans to develop languages of all kinds, and we have to use all of them. Mathematics is a language, even more than a science. Of course, all kinds of artistic expressions have their own languages. So we have to use all the languages, and we have to be aware that languages are frameworks, are limiting frameworks, but also are incredible tools for the development of our ideas and concepts. But let's be aware that Ilya Prigozhin said, you know, reality is much richer than we can describe within a language. So the ambition of finding or creating a language which will be able to fulfill all our purposes is in a way similar to the ambition of creating one unified theory. And I think it's not worth, that's my first guess, it's not worth the effort, you know. Rather, we should be aware of the multiplicity of languages which are available, and start from the questions from the ground, you know, from the ground, meaning from the challenges that people are living in their own contexts, in their own communities, and all our capacities and all our languages at the service of those questions. Yeah, so I see that Stephen is, maybe you want to intervene, Stephen, instead of just putting your comments on the chat.
Yes, Stephen, it's easier. We still have 5 or 6 minutes.
Yeah, no, this is a question that's come up in the last couple of days when we've been talking about the possibility within the framework of Apheleia and coalition approaches to project building, that are taking as a starting point the ambition, for instance, of integrating knowledge communities from different scientific traditions, as well as perhaps non-formal educational and scientific traditions, but equally valid and very important indigenous knowledge or other forms of local knowledge. And so this idea has come up in conversation a couple of times about how do we actually break down the cacophony of different terms for the same thing, or the same terms meaning different things that cut across different scientific traditions. And so it's with this in mind, rather than any specific language, but what we need to do to sort of try to get more on the same page, because we exert a lot of effort in just trying to make sense to one another, sometimes misunderstanding one another.
Yeah, true. But no, I agree. I agree with you. This is a challenge, but maybe this is a challenge we have to take from the side of, let's recognize everybody that, as Prigogine said, reality is beyond words anyway. The most important things in life, you cannot even define them. So I know that in the scientific tradition, especially the Western scientific tradition, we are obsessed with definitions. We want to define the object we are analyzing, the object of our study, and try to have as precise definitions as, which is effective in many ways. But let's not cheat ourselves in thinking that we can do that with everything, or because that would be the dream of capturing life, words, and life is beyond our words. And because just try again to define love, or try to define life, you will end up doing circular definitions in which love is what people in love experiment, so and so on. So maybe the first element is and coming back to the question of what is a learned person, maybe a learned person today is a person who is able to realize that there are many different lenses to use to look at reality. Maybe a learned person is somebody who is aware that there are different worldviews, that basically each verbal language is the result of an historical process, is embodying a different worldviews, that English and Chinese, not to talk about indigenous languages, but English and Chinese embody different worldviews. And then be, the trained in the gymnastic of using different lenses as a first step, to work with these difficulties of, we don't understand each other, let's try to find one definition, No, we don't understand each other, and this is a richness, and let's try to understand what you mean when you say something, or when you behave in a certain way, and what I mean when I say something or behave in a certain way.
If I may.
You are on mute. You are on mute, Stephen.
No, can you hear me?
No, I was just saying thanks very much, and food for more thought and discussion, I think.
So sorry for that.
You were talking about this flexibility. The issue of mastering what the others are saying is clearly a concern of adults. In adults in our civilization, children don't have that problem. This is why they don't have any barriers in communicating. They can speak without any problem. with anyone among them, with us. We don't understand whatever they are saying, but they keep on on talking, and everything works. But in my question to you, I had several questions, but we don't have time. But I have one provocative question. You mentioned that we cannot expect innovation solutions for the future from those who accumulated, if I understood correctly, who sit on the power in different dimensions, particularly because they are older. How do you see that a society can be transformed if for the first time in human evolution we have an aged society in which young people became, in the majority of the world, a minority? Even in Africa, which is the only continent where population still grows, it doesn't grow in any of the big cities. So it's aging, so it grows arithmetically, but it's actually going against the wall. We will have less population by the end of this century. Whatever we do helps. Wars may help, but even without wars, we will get there. The big question, we have seen it. Sometimes people talk about it. For example, in the Brexit, when the older people voted for breakfast, for Brexit. Well, older people voted for breakfast, and younger people thought on eating for the rest of their lives. So they were actually voting against. But this goes deeper. How do you see we can reconnect, reorganize, reintegrate? Because in the end, this approach of the fifth element, as you said, is present in many traditional cultures. I would argue that even the notion of religion, religare, goes in the same direction. So there was always an understanding that things easily go in disparate directions, and there is a need for bringing them together again with their own complexity. But now we are old. So where is the energy and the courage to change? This
wow,
is
that's
for lunch.
That's an easy question, Luis, right? I mean, a very good one, as could be expected from your side. Yeah, just some elements that one on power, because maybe I gave a rather pessimistic perspective on, since power is the ability not to have to learn anything, we cannot expect anything from existing institutions. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that being aware of this nature of power as opposed to learning, we have to work in all contexts. And this is pretty much what the Club of Rome does, trying to work in very different contexts to move but also of engaging with people in power, not in a non-confrontational way. Sometimes people say to us, but you are not considering power in your approach. And I say, yes, we do, but not in the usual way. What we are trying to do is the transformation will be real if we talk with power from an epistemology which is no longer the epistemology of power, but it's another one, ultimately the dissolution of power, if you will. So, but there is a lot to do in exchanging and with existing institutions, with the establishment. And as usual, you find in particular individuals, which are, this is also what I mentioned about the dissonances, that you find a lot of individuals in the existing institutions who live in that dissonance and know that what we are doing at the institutional level is not enough or not even appropriate. We have to work with them. So that's a first comment. Second comment on your comment on the aging society is spot on, because I think a lot of the fears we have to change and a lot of the anxiety we have about the future and about being in control of what the future will bring can be directly connected to this phenomenon of aging. You know, we all tend to become more conservative with age and more afraid of, because in the end, all fears are connected to one, which of course is the fear of death. You know, so how do we overcome the additional inertia coming from the fact that societies are aging? I don't know yet. I can say what we are trying. And what we are trying is to engage, which is untypical in the Club of Rome, you know, to really engage in intergenerational dialogues and processes of mutual learning. Again, getting out of the paradigm of let's teach to the next generation when they need to know, because at this point in time we don't know. We cannot say that the current generations in power, if you wish, know what are the recipes for the way out of the mess in which we are. So we started 4 years ago a process by which we said, okay, and how do we do this? You know, one of the questions was, how do we do this in a non-patronizing, non-tokenist way of, oh, let's have some young people. And what we did was simply support the existence of what is now an organization, but there are many more that there is one with which whose creation we supported, which is the 50%. By the way, the society is aging, yes, but let me tell you, people under 30 are 50% of the planet. And this is why they decided to adopt that name. And to engage into intergenerational work, difficult as it may be, because that dimension of are we taking care of the coming generations is generally not present or not present enough in our societal debates, you know. And yes, society is aging, but people still, probably the most important element they value is the lives of their kids, the lives of their children, lives and grandchildren, you know. So it continues to be, because we are humans, continues to be an element to move people from where they are. So I think we have to bring in the work we do, the next generations, so that they become an actor, a fundamental actor of what we try to learn and learn together with them. And this is what we are doing, you know, in collaboration with partners. For instance, with the St. Gallen Symposium in Switzerland, we are working on the idea of a new generational contract, quote unquote, meaning that if there was to be a contract between the current generations and the future generations, what would you put in that contract? You know, big question. But bringing the factor of the future into the present through the people who are younger in our work. And last but not least, you mentioned Africa, and this is very much why I'm starting to use this expression of mutual metamorphosis. So Africa is still a very young continent compared to others, but it's also the continent where most of the growth in population will happen in the future. Prospect is 1 billion more people in Africa by 2050. The rest of the continents will either decline or grow a little bit, but most of the growth will happen in Africa, which means that by then, 2050, I think 40%, so by far the largest number of people under 30 will be Africans. And that's very strong dynamic. That's a very strong 4%. you know, oh my God, 1 billion more people, you know, in Europe particularly, we're obsessed with migrations. 1 billion more people in Africa, that looks like terrible threat. Why don't we use that as a lever, that momentum as a lever to question where is Europe, where is Africa, engage in a process of mutual metamorphosis? Because we cannot escape from that reality, you know, and Africa will have to be different, also to give hope and well-being to those many more Africans. But Europe will necessarily be to have different, because we cannot dream of, you know, building walls and barriers and preserve our current status, you know, as the aging society and fearful society that we are becoming. We know that dream of being isolated is first, it is a nightmare, and second, it is impossible to hold. So this is one of the arguments for which we are pushing for concretely a process of discussions between African and European actors on this idea of mutual metamorphosis. So I don't know the answer to your question, but this is what we are trying.
Thank you very much, Carlos. I think we will stay with your words for lunch. I'm a very much more pragmatic or simple, if you wish, or reductionist. As you know, I don't think population growth is a problem, and I do think not having children is a problem. So I think it's good that the population is growing in some parts of Africa, and it's in terms of human evolution, it's also very interesting, because the Big Bang of humans was the out of Africa. So
yep.
Maybe it's going back there. And then it goes back. Everyone goes back to Africa. It
we
will
are
happen. So Ronaldo is smiling over there because he's imagining himself in Africa. I think we have to think about it. Anyway, unless someone wants to go and have babies, you can have lunch. And so enjoy.
But I fully agree with you, Luis, and I would say to a large extent we are coming back to where we once belonged.
Yeah.
So in the fifth element, reconnecting with Africa, also because you know, one of our co-presidents of the Club of Rome is Mampela Rampele, who started in the 60s the Black consciousness movement in South Africa. We are putting a lot of focus on, okay, how do we reconnect with our origins, with our own humanity, which means reconnecting with our origins, with the continent where not only human life started, but also human civilizations started, you know. But how do we do that into the future in non-conventional ways, you know? As sometimes, you know, I mean, often fiction goes before, you know. I don't know if you're aware of the movies Black Panther, the movie series Black Panther, imagining a future where Africa is actually the most advanced, while not betraying, while keeping its own traditions, you know. So that's interesting.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and for joining us, and I hope everything will be okay with you. And well, let's give him an applause.
Thank you so much.
And
take care and enjoy.
And now I wish everyone a good lunch. See you at 2:30.
Thanks,
Thank you, Carlos. Take care.
Thank you to you guys.
Bye.
Sorry for not being there. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.